In this particular lesson, we're going to look at one of the steps in factoring trinomials, which I'm going to call the x problem, or working with the x problem. You'll note that the assignment that you get today, it'll have each of the problems will have an equal 0 on it. We're not worried about that exactly quite yet. That's called the zero product property, which we're going to use to actually solve these trinomials eventually and figure out what x equals. But in order to figure out what x equals using the zero product property, we first actually have to factor each of these. And so that's what we're going to be working on today, is just one of the steps in actually factoring these guys. So if you remember from the last lesson video, the first step is to identify A, B, and C. Okay, there's actually even a pre-step before then, which would be to factor out a greatest common factor if there is one. So you'd have to run through that process of finding the GCF, dividing the greatest common factor out, and ending up with something like this as a final answer, which we've done in previous lessons, so I'm not going to cover that now. And in all of the problems that you have on your homework, none of them will have a greatest common factor. So you can go ahead and say, nope, I already checked, no greatest common factor because Mr. Winchell said so, and jump right into this first step of identifying A, B, and C. So here A equals 3, B equals 6, and C equals 18. Right, go and watch the lesson video from last week if you're not quite sure how to do that. The next step is to actually create our x problem. No notes for you to take today, just kind of watch along. Eventually I'll have all of the steps listed out on a note sheet that I'll have you write everything down on. But anyway, here's our x problem, and we're going to fill in stuff on the top and the bottom today. And then in the lesson on Wednesday, we'll practice figuring out how to figure out what goes here and here in our x problem. So in the top of the x problem goes our A term times our C term. And note that I say the whole term, and we'll see why on Wednesday I want you to write the whole term. And down here goes B. And again, I want the whole term, so not just the number 6. So I'll kind of show you what that looks like. So on the top there, I need to multiply A and C. And I'm going to look at A as being the whole piece, being 3x squared. And I need to multiply that by C, which is 18. Okay. And I lied, actually, now that I'm looking at this one does have a greatest common factor. So let me go ahead and back up a little bit. If we were to find a greatest common factor and actually factor that guy out, the common number here is 3. Parentheses, we'd have x squared plus 2x plus 9. So, sorry, our new A is this guy 1, B is 2, and C is 9. So I'm going to now do 1, which is A, and I'm going to do the whole term. So 1x squared times C, which is 9. This one's pretty easy, right? Because 9 times 1 is 9, and x squared times 1 is just x squared. So what goes on the top of my x problem is actually going to be 9x squared. And then the bottom of my x problem, I put B, and I'm going to do the whole term, which is 2x. And that's it. That's all you're doing today is practicing setting up that x problem. But you do need to identify A, B, and C first. So that's a bad example because none of the problems on your homework today should have a greatest common factor that you have to factor out first. We're going to get practice on some without a greatest common factor first, and then later as we get better at it, I'll start throwing in some greatest common factors. So here, there's my A term, B term, C term. Just know that if at any point any tests ask you to identify A, B, and C, all they want are just the numbers, okay? The numbers in front of those first two terms and then the number at the very end where C equals 8. And of course, if it wasn't listed there, like if I didn't have an 8 there at all, C would just be 0, right? It would be gone. Okay, so again, in the top of my x problem goes A times C, and in the bottom of my x problem goes B. So let's take my A term, negative 3x squared, and multiply it by my C term, which is 8. Okay, let's multiply the big numbers. 8 times negative 3 is going to get us negative 24, and then just bring down my x squared, so negative 24x squared. That's what goes, so it goes on the top of my x problem there. And in the bottom of my x problem, I'm going to put what B was, making sure to include the sign, okay? So this one's a positive 2x. So once again, I'm just going to write 2x. Okay, if it was a negative 2x, I'd need to make it negative. Here again, let's do my x problem. I know that I'm going to have a times c in the top and my b term in the bottom. And let's identify. So a equals 8. I'll just write the whole term, 8x squared. It's not technically correct, but I'm going to write that. B equals negative x, or negative 1x, I can write. And c equals 8. I'm going to do a times c, so 8x squared times 8. 8 times 8 gets me 64, and then x squared. So that's what goes on the top of my x problem there, 64x squared. And then the bottom of my x problem, I got to put b, which is a negative x. So it's not just x. Make sure that it's actually a negative x. And just so you're aware, this guy right here is your answer to today's problems, because I want you to just do the x problem. Just set it up, not even solve it. Let's take a look at a few more examples here. X squared plus 5x plus 1. So I know I need an x problem. The whole term is going to be x squared. B is 5x, right? In reality, a is 1 and b is 5, but I'm just writing it all the way, the whole thing, c equals 1. Let's do a times c, x squared times 1, which anything times 1 is itself, so that's just going to get me x squared. So that's what goes on the top. And in the bottom goes my middle term, which we determined was 5x, and boom, that's it. So all you need for a final answer is just that x problem there. Okay, let's take a look at this guy. Again, I know I'm going to do an x problem. Multiply a times c in the top, b goes in the bottom. So let's see, a, the whole term, negative x squared, b, negative 3x, and c is the number hanging out at the end, negative 27 in this case. I'm going to do a, negative x squared, times c, negative 27. Negative times a negative gets me a positive, so that's 27x squared. That's what goes on the top of my x problem. What goes on the bottom is the middle term, including the sign that comes in front of it. So it's a negative 3x. So not just 3x, negative 3x. And I already saw that. Don't need that anymore. Last one I want to look at here. 16x squared minus x minus 2. Now I'm going to need an x problem. Let's identify what the whole term is. The whole a term is 16x squared. The whole b term is negative 1x, right? I'm including that negative sign that shows up in front of the x. And my c term equals negative 2. Again, now I'm just going to do a times c, the whole term, whole piece. So number and variable, even though the number is technically the only thing that's a. 16x squared times a negative 2. 16 times a negative 2 is actually going to get me a negative 32. And I still have my x squared, negative 32x squared. And in the bottom goes my middle term, including the sign that comes in front of it. So that's going to be negative x, or negative 1x. You can write it either way. And your final answer is just that x problem there. With these guys right here, you know you'll have done it right because you'll have an x squared on the top of your x problem and just an x to the power of 1 on the bottom for all of the examples we're working on today. So that's just your homework, is start that get practice with multiplying a times c and then writing b in the bottom to form an x problem.